In warehouse number 11, where dust didn't just settle, it lived, where the numbers on the boxes froze under the gaze of the system scanner, and people passed each other so quickly they looked like frames from a sped up film. She worked. From day one, without a break, without complaints, without vacations, without career plans, without grand words, without trying to prove she was worth something, too. And no one could quite remember when she'd started because she simply was like the concrete floor, like the iron shelves, like the old label with a worn out barcode that no one even tried to replace anymore. Her name was Varya, but almost everyone called her slow, not with malice, but with weariness, with condescension, with that tone adults use when they say, well, what can you expect from her? Because Varya really didn't rush, didn't fuss, didn't snatch fallen boxes off the floor with a sharp, on it, boss, didn't jump into chats with jokes, didn't repost motivational quotes. She simply walked, slowly, carefully, as if weighing each step, and if someone said, hurry up, she didn't get offended, just nodded and kept going at her pace. And no one noticed how she watched, not vaguely, not stupidly, not wearily, but how she observed, how she remembered, not by assignment, not by order, but by her own internal logic, how she scanned the shelves with her eyes, how she distinguished similar boxes by barely noticeable dents, by the placement of the staples, by the way the light behaved on the packaging. How she noticed that the code scanned today didn't match the ones from a week ago. How she built in her mind a fragile but living map of the flow of goods, not by schematics, but by the warehouse's breath, by how the gates opened and closed, by the footsteps of those who entered, by where the carts most often broke down, by which crate had weakened fittings. And when someone shouted, there you go dawdling again, she didn't explain, didn't look back, didn't try to say that in that moment she was memorizing not just a code, but an error, a discrepancy no one else would see, because everyone was in a rush and she wasn't, not because she couldn't, but because she knew hurried minds don't see where they're running, and certainly don't remember where they made mistakes. And this went on for years, steady, monotonous years, like the roots of the forklifts, like the beeps of the sensors, like the dull beep of every scanner, until one day, on a perfectly ordinary morning, the system crashed. Not a minor glitch, not a short outage, but a total failure. Data didn't load, shipments didn't match, a batch went missing, box numbers vanished, and the database empty. Just a white screen and a blinking cursor, like a scene from a movie about the end of civilization. Except this was a warehouse where everything was supposed to be precise, fast, exact. And then all the people who always knew where to run began to panic because there was nowhere to run. The scanners were dead, and the head logistician was speechless because he couldn't even remember the name of the guy who'd packed the night shift. And all those who were once efficient were now blind, because all the maps were in the computer, and the computer was gone. But Varya simply stood up, took off her gloves, walked over to the stand, and without looking at the system, began calling out the boxes, one by one, from memory, by placement, by shape, by the sound they made when opened, by the weight with which they were set down, by the absence of a stain she'd noticed 3 weeks ago, by a logic no one had recorded, by a route she had mapped within herself, and for the first time, everyone fell silent, because they realized she wasn't walking slowly. She was walking toward what they were too afraid to even look at. She stood in the middle of the warehouse, between the collapsed system and the disoriented people, between the silence where machines usually roared and the gaze of the manager who, for the first time, wasn't looking past her, but directly at her face. And it felt as if everything happening now was impossible, not because it was strange, but because no one had factored into the equation a scenario in which the only person capable of restoring the flow would be the one whose name had been left off the list for the corporate bus, because she always walked home. And while the others rushed from terminal to terminal, from the logistics officer to the foreman, from panic to the team chat where no one knew what to do, she stepped forward, unhurried as always, as if simply doing what she'd always done. Only now it became visible, because all those who pretended to know where to go had vanished. And while the team debated the failure, she quietly made her way to the farthest row, the same one where a rack broke 2 months ago and everyone forgot to report it to tech support. And she had simply gone around it and started memorizing how the boxes now lay, which ones bent, which sat longer than usual, which forklifts creaked on the turn, how the light shifted when the shelf was slightly off, what the shadow looked like if the batch stood in the wrong place. And none of this was heroism or talent or even a job description. It was her own coordinate system, alive, breathing, built not from numbers, but from observation, from rhythm, from trust in the details others ignored. And without asking, without checking, she began to list things as if reading a book no one else had ever opened. Sector E, third shelf from the left, top level, batch 1024B. It shifted 10 centimeters because last week a forklift hit the side beam. It's now tilted 2 degrees. The boxes lie differently. One is flipped, the code is on the underside, and you won't find it unless you turn it over. And when they checked, everything matched. Not roughly, not close enough, but exactly. To the millimeter, to the dentist, to the tiniest details that weren't in any system. And then one of the logistics guys, the youngest, asked, "How did you remember all that?" And she said without looking up, "I didn't remember. I just saw it every day. And when you look every day, you start to see." She knew where the missing shipments were because she'd heard the creak of a door late in the evening, a door no one was supposed to open. She knew where the order everyone had been searching for over 3 days was because the packaging smelled different. The new batch came from another supplier, and the paper had a different scent. She knew where the product had vanished because the sticker on the box used a different font, slapped on in a hurry, and only she had noticed. She knew everything others dismissed as insignificant because to her there were no minor details. There were traces, and every trace led to the truth. And on that day, when everything froze, when losses climbed into the millions, when the responsible ones ran to the IT department, when management wrote in the chat, "Why isn't there a backup?" Only she knew that the backup had always existed, not in the system, but in the person no one had ever trusted. No one had asked her to build a map, but she carried it within her, not because she wanted to, but because she couldn't not see. And now she was showing them the way, silently, precisely, not by the manual, but by memory. When everything started working again, not according to the plan, not by the manual, but because she remembered who had loaded what and when, where they had placed it, how the packaging tape smelled on the day they changed the labels, how the cart sounded when it was pulled along the new route, everything slowly returned to its place. And yet, that was the paradox. Everything was restored, but nothing was quite the same. Because in that moment, as she pieced everything back together, step by step, what others called a system failure was, in truth, a failure to trust human attention. And it was then that a certain look began to appear in the eyes of some employees. Not respect, not gratitude, but that awkward, heavy, uneasy confusion that creeps in when you suddenly realize all this time you were running, shouting, making decisions, holding meetings, and the person you never even looked at turns out to be the one who knew more than you ever dared to imagine. At first there was awe, quiet, cautious, like a child realizing their mother knew everything all along. But then came unease, and then irritation. Because it's easier to say she got lucky than to admit that you didn't see what was right in front of you because you were too busy rushing. And that's when the whispers started. She must have read something somewhere. Maybe she has access to something. Someone should check how she even knows all this. This isn't normal. What is she, some kind of walking computer? And although no one ever said it to her face, she could feel it, just like she always felt when someone new raised an eyebrow during inspections. Has she been here long? Because Varya didn't make eye contact, didn't smile on cue, didn't lift her head when someone important walked in. She simply knew their hurry wasn't strength. It was fear. And that fear grew stronger with every accurate move she made, every match, every time she found what no one else even thought to look for. They began avoiding her, not openly, but in small things. They stopped asking for her help, stopped asking how she figured it out, stopped thanking her. They just walked around her. One of the foremen, the same one who used to shout, "Slowpoke," the loudest, now kept quiet, but every time she passed, he stared into his phone like it was glued to his hand. And the shift manager once said, half jokingly, "Well, Varya, you've got a spy brain. Maybe you're walking around with a hidden camera." And in that half joke was all the truth they couldn't afford to admit. Because to admit that the woman they had ignored all this time was simply seeing meant admitting that they hadn't. And that meant they had built everything on blindness. But Varya wasn't hurt. She kept walking, slowly, because she knew people run only to avoid meeting themselves. But she never ran. The system came back online. The IT team restored a backup. The logistics team conducted a cross-check. Management held a meeting and solemnly concluded that it had been a non-standard situation, but a swift response was carried out, and all participants demonstrated flexibility in problem solving. Not once was Varya's name mentioned, and that wasn't surprising, because in systems built on title plaques and quarterly reports, there is no field for someone who simply knows. Varya's precision didn't fit into any schema because it didn't come from protocol. It came from observation, from lived experience, from instincts no KPI can track, from logic that can't be explained but always works. If you're willing to trust attention over algorithms, the warehouse was up and running again, or so it seemed. But something had shifted, not in the sound, in the behavior. People started looking at each other a bit more often. Doubt crept in, not about others, but about themselves. And in that doubt, tension settled. So when, a week later, a new shipment arrived, urgent, tangled, from 6 different suppliers, with half the boxes failing the scan and others duplicated, no one knew where to begin. The warehouse bots froze, label verification failed, and from every screen came the same response: no match found. In the meeting room filled with all the responsible parties, there was only one question: how do we prevent another failure? But no one said Varya's name, not because they forgot, but because they remembered too well, because her quiet certainty, without explanations, frightened them, because if she figured it out again, it would mean they still hadn't seen, and so they made a plan. We'll handle it ourselves. They assigned an observer, brought in another specialist, asked the logistics team to draft a manual delivery plan. In short, they tightened the control to make sure the recovery wouldn't happen without them this time. And Varya, she just stood at the back entrance, watching the crates being unloaded. And she saw some weren't on the order. One had skewed labeling, one was clearly rejected stock, one had a swapped code, another was from a different supplier, but taped to look like it was theirs. And in her mind, that familiar map was already forming, the one she never drew, but which always worked when everything else collapsed. She didn't go to the command room, didn't raise her hand, didn't intervene, because she knew if people refused to see, you're not obligated to make them. But she remembered everything, every code, every cent, every shifted sticker. And when, 2 days later, the system crashed again, not just the data flow, but the entire logic of the warehouse. When orders began disappearing, when losses became measurable, and the manager finally said, "Call Varya," she didn't react like a hero. She just put on her gloves, walked to the table, and calmly, as if it were just another Tuesday, said, "Let's start with the box you accepted as 14B. It's not 14B, it's 11C. It was by the loading door, not the receiving bay." That's what shifted the entire batch. Don't look for what's missing, look for what's been displaced. Everything else will fall into place. And again, silence, because once more, she was right. No computer, no diagrams, just memory. And someone, almost in a whisper, said, "She carries the only plan that hasn't failed." But there were no applause, no thanks, because it was frightening to realize that your speed was your blindness, and her slowness was the only thing that actually saved anything. After the second failure, when once again it was she, not them, not the system, not the module, not an urgent update, not a group chat, or a late-night session with an analyst. It was she who saved the situation, restored the flow, rebuilt the movement, not by role, not by instruction, not by command, but because she saw, felt, remembered, understood. They could no longer ignore her, could no longer push her into the corner, make her invisible again, return her to the status of background. Because now, in every meeting where logistics were discussed, one question always surfaced. Has Varya looked at this? And even if it wasn't said out loud, it was there in the glances, the pauses, the look over the shoulder that meant, what does she think? It wasn't official, wasn't stated, but it felt like a new rule. She wasn't the boss, but her knowledge had become the silence by which loud decisions were measured, and that made people uneasy. Because in a system built on control, regulations, hierarchy, where the leader is the one who speaks, not the one who sees, her silence began to create a kind of power that couldn't be fired because she broke no rules, couldn't be subdued because she never interfered, and couldn't be bypassed because now everyone knew, without her, the system couldn't hold. And Varya felt it, not with joy, not with pride, but with the same silence with which she saw everything. She knew people had grown afraid to thank her because acknowledgement creates dependency, and dependency is frightening. One of the foremen started joking louder than usual, deliberately pretending nothing had happened when she was around. One of the girls in the logistics department said, almost defensively, "She just has a good memory. What's the big deal?" And the shift manager once muttered, "Well, in the end, we all work together. No need to make her a hero." But no one saw how, at the end of her shift, she would sit by the back wall, drinking water from her plastic bottle, and in her mind, she was once again building a route. Not because someone asked her to, not because she liked it, but because everything inside her had long become a map, where it was impossible not to notice if something was moved, mislabeled, slipped in, or shifted. And that's why, when the largest shipment of the season was being prepared a few weeks later and leadership gathered for a strategic meeting, one of the directors, without consulting anyone, simply said, "Can we invite Varya just in case? She might spot something we missed." And she came, stood in the corner, listened, stayed silent, and only at the very end, when everything had already been assigned, signed, laid out, she calmly said, "If you load into Zone D as planned, you'll lose 4 positions because Shelf 5H has been shifted due to internal repairs. They didn't notify you, but I saw the changes on the blueprints. You'll have a gap." Silence then. "How do you know that?" She answered, "I was just there." I looked. I always look. And from that moment, they didn't fear her as a threat, but as a reminder that it is possible to know without a title, to understand without words, to see without recognition, and to survive without support. She never asked to lead, but now her knowledge couldn't be turned off. She never said anything unnecessary, never discussed decisions behind anyone's back, never built coalitions, never held private conversations with management, never showed ambition, never asked for a raise, never hinted at a promotion, never even said what she could have said when they looked her in the eye and lied about collective achievement, even though the entire system held together because it was she, and only she, who first saw when things were going wrong. And only she could point out the exact breach, even if it was hidden behind a perfectly constructed Excel spreadsheet. She, and no one else, kept the structure from total collapse, not because she craved power, but because she simply couldn't not see when things were being put together wrong. And still, it turned out to be too much. She had stayed silent for too long. Too many people had grown used to her shadow. Her invisibility had become too visible. And then, one Friday at the end of the shift, just as everyone was getting ready to leave, a message appeared in the group chat. "Starting Monday, we're introducing internal redistribution. Some employees will temporarily move to the archive sorting zone. Please be understanding." And she saw her name, no explanation, no reason, just removed from the current flow, as if they wanted to put her back where she'd started, as nobody, so she wouldn't stand nearby, so she wouldn't say, "You put that in the wrong place," so her memory wouldn't scare them, so she could be silenced again, only this time, officially. On Monday, she arrived, said good morning to no one in particular, walked into the sorting zone, sat at the table, took a stack of invoices, started flipping through them, and everything might have gone smoothly, without conflict, quietly, if not for one random moment. A new worker at loading mixed up a shipment, and she, sitting in another zone, heard the number and calmly said, "That batch belongs on platform 6, not 8. It won't go through dispatch. You'll lose one set." At first, no one responded. Then they checked, and everything matched. Everything. Down to the digit, again. And then one of the shift workers, the one who had always smiled at her with no hidden agenda, suddenly, aloud, asked, "Why is Varya in sorting now? She just saved us again." And the silence that followed that question was no longer her silence. It was the silence of those who had begun to see. That day, for the first time, Varya didn't feel loneliness, but movement, not revolution, but a quiet awakening. She hadn't come to prove anything. She simply stood up and said, "If I'm in the way, I'll leave. But if you still want the system to live, I'll stay, not for the title, for the sake of order, order as truth, not the kind in reports, the kind that exists inside things if you lay them out right." And for the first time ever, no one told her no. After she spoke those words, calmly, simply, without demand, without challenge, and without fear, as if she weren't addressing management at all, but merely voicing an inner truth she had carried too long, the air in the room changed, not abruptly, not dramatically, but noticeably, as if someone had quietly removed an invisible barrier between people, and the gazes that were usually fixed on scanners or phone screens began to lift, searching for other eyes to meet. Because when one person finds the strength to say aloud what everyone else has been silently feeling, it doesn't just free them. It frees those who have long forgotten how to speak their mind without fear of being mocked, interrupted, or ignored. And during that same shift after her sentence, that simple line, which in reality was a threshold, one of the female employees approached the logistics manager and said, not loudly, but clearly enough, "If Varya is moving to Sorton, then I want to go there too, because where she is, there's order, and right now this place is chaos." It wasn't a protest nor a demand, just a quiet recentering. Where there is order, that's where I want to be. And it didn't land like a complaint, but like a chain reaction, because shortly after, during the break, one of the night loaders, who usually stayed out of conversations, stood by the layout board for a minute and then asked, "Why did all our routes start getting messed up only after she was transferred?" No one answered him, but the silence that followed wasn't the usual kind. It was that dense, aware tension that can't be dismissed with words. Only with the inner knowing, we all knew. We all stayed silent, and now we can't anymore. And that wave didn't make noise, didn't organize protests, didn't become petitions. It was silence, but no longer her private one. Not the silence she retreated into when ignored, not the silence she used to hide her memory so as not to frighten others. This was a shared silence, connecting everyone as if the entire warehouse, this massive, noisy, dusty organism had begun, for the first time, to listen to itself from within. And then Varya understood, not in her head, not logically, but viscerally, that the silence she had carried inside for all these years no longer belonged to her alone. Because now others were beginning to recognize something of themselves in it, their own pain, their own invisibility, their own attentiveness, their own ability to see in details what the important ones ignored. And no one laughed at her pace anymore. No one rushed her. No one yelled from across the warehouse, "Hey, slowpoke," because now that slowness had become the right rhythm. And when a young trainee came up to her and said, "Last night I tried walking like you, slowly. And you know what? For the first time, I noticed how they parked the carts by Zone 3, always crooked. And I realized that's why everything clogs up there." She simply nodded, said nothing, but inside, something warm lit up. That rare warmth you feel when the knowledge you carry is no longer yours alone, but begins to spread like roots. And you understand. Now it lives. He had always been a space, cold, rectangular, with straight lines of shelves, numbers on labels, metallic echoes in empty zones, carts creaking in sync with the loading process, people who appeared and disappeared, shifts that followed one another without thought, boxes moving along routes programmed into the system, but entirely lifeless because no one listened to him, felt him, perceived him as something that required attention, as if he were just a transport shell, a faceless machine you feed data into and get a result from. But when Varya became not just part of that space, but its ears, its memory, its rhythm, the rhythm that lives between numbers, between scans, between movements, something inside that concrete rectangle began to change. At first, imperceptibly, as if by coincidence, someone began placing carts along the flow, not across it, because they'd seen how she silently turned to pass by and understood. This way makes more sense. Then others began checking labels more often, not because they feared making mistakes, but because they suddenly realized they too could see if they stopped chasing speed. And it wasn't a miracle, it wasn't a revolution. There were no slogans. No one gave speeches about changing the warehouse. No manifestos were written. No Team Varya was formed. But something else happened. People began to listen, not to each other, not to managers, but to the process itself. The path of the box, the movement of the cart, and one morning, when a shipment with non standard labeling arrived before the system had time to update it, three employees came to Varya, not as a boss, not as some chief expert, but as someone who could feel, and asked, "Did you see where this came from?" And she, without checking a single document, said, "It's from 7E. They shifted the label because of the new packaging, but it's the same batch. Don't put it in the cold section. The packaging won't hold up, even though technically it's supposed to go there." And no one went to check with the manager. No one raised an eyebrow asking, "Are you sure?" They just nodded and followed her advice. Because they knew, if she says it, it's not a guess. It's knowledge born from observation. And observation is always stronger than orders because it's tied to what you've actually seen. And in those moments, the warehouse stopped being just a warehouse. It became a living organism, with its own breath, its own failures, its own broken rhythms and slow realignments. And now, when Varya walked along the shelves, no one mocked her, no one rushed her, no one yelled from across the floor, "Hey, slowpoke." On the contrary, they stepped aside, they listened. Sometimes they simply watched her walk. Because in that movement was something everyone had been missing: confidence without hurry, knowledge without control, presence without intrusion. And when newcomers entering the high pressure zones for the first time would ask, "Who's in charge here?" someone would always say, "Varya's here." And that didn't mean there was a nameplate or an assigned title or a printed schedule, but there was something much more important: trust. Because trust is never handed out, it's earned. And she didn't fight for it, didn't ask for it, didn't explain it. She just lived in her rhythm. And now that rhythm had become the pulse of the entire warehouse, not officially, not on paper, but truly, because it was the only thing holding the system together when everything else failed, because it was the only thing creating order that didn't depend on programming. And one evening, when the lights in the hall were already half off and only one sector remained lit, because an urgent shipment was being manually packed, Varya walked over, looked, said nothing, just adjusted a box that had shifted 3 centimeters and could have toppled the entire stack. And the one packing, it said, "Thanks, it would have all fallen apart again," and added, a bit quieter, "It's like you are this warehouse." And in that moment, for the first time, Varya smiled, just slightly, because maybe for the first time, someone understood that she didn't just remember. She lived this space, not as a workplace, but as a place where every step mattered. And from that day on, everyone working near her began to notice how simple things took on new meaning when you stopped doing them on autopilot and started doing them consciously like she did, slowly, deeply, precisely. And the warehouse, which had always run by timers, by shifts, by deadlines and numbers, for the first time began to breathe, not on command, but in rhythm, in her rhythm. No one knew exactly when her steps stopped being just one among many, when her presence in a sector ceased to be background, when her slow movement suddenly became the internal calibration of the entire rhythm. because it didn't happen in a day, it didn't come as news, it wasn't posted in the group chat, wasn't tracked by the system, wasn't noticed by the cameras, wasn't discussed in meetings, didn't show up in timesheets. It just happened. At some point, everyone began to align themselves with how she walked, where she paused, what she looked at, which way she moved a box. And it happened quietly but constantly, as if she was the inner compass of the warehouse, the unofficial, unspoken point of reference, one that others checked against without even realizing they were doing it. Because no one asked them to, no one made them. It was just that one day you caught yourself doing something differently because she had once done it that way and it worked better. So you remembered and did it again. And things started falling into place more smoothly. And that's why, when she didn't come in on Monday, didn't text, didn't call, didn't show up for her shift, just quietly vanished into the morning air, nothing loud happened at first. The lights came on, the forklifts hummed to life, the terminals booted, the shift began. People arrived, documents loaded, everything as usual, everything on schedule. And yet something inside the structure felt off, like a screw left loose, a door left slightly ajar, a sound just not quite right. At first, it only showed in behavior. Someone took longer to find a cart, someone got off route, someone checked a code twice because they weren't sure. Just small morning things, nothing more. But with each passing minute, the feeling thickened, quieted, condensed, as if a weak but familiar current had disappeared from the building. Everything still worked, but it no longer lived. Because when someone walks past shelves with that much precision, with that much memory, with that much attention, their absence is not an empty space. It's a hairline fracture, one that spreads from one glance to another. And then suddenly, the logistician says louder than usual, "Check block 2, batch 7C should be there." But no one moves. Everyone looks at each other, and the same thought crosses every mind. Maybe Varya would have already found it. And then a forklift operator goes off course and heads into a sector marked for reassignment, only to realize the access door is blocked, and the batch he was supposed to pick up had been relocated by an internal order from the shift manager, which no one communicated. If Varya had been there, she would have noticed. She would have seen the light reflect differently. She would have recognized the label color change. She would have felt that the floor under the cart was just slightly more slippery. She would have known before it became a problem. And then the foreman, in a rush, tries to get the systems guy on the phone because there's been a misfire in batch uploads and the system isn't showing proper placement. And once again, someone in the room says, "If Varya," but doesn't finish because everyone already knows, yes, if she were here, this wouldn't have happened. Not because she knew everything, but because she saw everything. And to see is to be part of the system not as a mechanism, but as a living organ, to feel its pressure, its curves, its breakdowns before they become failures. And by midday, when several small but unpleasant errors had piled up, no one said catastrophe, no one yelled, no one blamed, no one conducted a post-mortem. But in every department, in every sector, the same question lingered, not spoken aloud, but felt in the tension, in the pause between movements, in the long stares into empty aisles. Where is she? Because by now, she would have passed by the shelf no one checked today, adjusted the box that had just fallen, paused at the loading zone they nearly broke. All of it, the tiny things no one can control from above, had held the entire place together from within like threads, like nerves, like invisible but vital links. And on this day, when everything technically worked, and yet everything felt unaligned, it became clear just how much had depended on her presence. Not loud, not official, not publicly respected, but deep, silent, precise. And when, at the end of the shift, the department head approached the shift coordinator and asked with a tinge of unease, "Are you sure everything shipped out correctly?" The coordinator shrugged, uncertain, and muttered, "I think so. It's just Varya wasn't here today. So it all felt kind of off." And those words, spoken casually, became the period at the end of the day, a day that showed everyone when she stopped, nothing collapsed, but balance was lost. And that was the loudest statement she had ever made in all her years. a silence that turned out to be a voice. When she returned, simply walked in the same uniform, with the same gait, the same thermos in her hand, and a plastic bag with 2 apples, not looking at anyone intentionally, not slowing her step, not smiling theatrically. She just came back, as if those 2 days hadn't happened, as if everything was going as it always had, as if the warehouse was just a warehouse, and the job just a job. But everyone who was inside at that moment felt it. Something in the air settled back into place, like sound aligning once more with movement, like someone had been listening to music with one headphone unplugged. And now it was clicked back in, and everything played in full again. It wasn't loud. There was no "you're back." No one ran to hug her. No scenes were made. But even in that calm, it was clear she had returned, and the rhythm had returned too. And what once seemed like small things, how she moved through a sector, adjusted a stack, paused to look at a label, softly said, "That doesn't go there." Suddenly all felt essential, because without her, the warehouse had been just a schematic. With her, it was memory, living, real, the only kind that knows not from a report, but from observation, from footsteps, from years of repetition, from that particular silence that's born not from fear, but from the ability to listen to what others overlook. And now, when a new employee nearly loaded a shipment onto the wrong platform, one of the forklift drivers gently said, "Hold on, wait. Let Varya take a look." And it wasn't said with submission or sarcasm, but with respect, almost relief, as if he could once again trust the route, knowing someone here could feel the system not as a table, but as a body. And when one of the logisticians approached her during break and said almost guiltily, "I'm sorry for, well, when we moved you. We just didn't understand." She looked at him calmly, nodded, said nothing, because forgiveness isn't a phrase, it's the moment when someone finally sees you not as a convenience, but as a value. And that was enough. Since then, no one asked her to go a bit faster. No one shuffled her to another sector. No one dismissed her remarks. On the contrary, when talk began about automation and a new routing system, someone immediately said, "We need to check everything with Varya first. She knows better than anyone where everything actually is." And it wasn't flattery or formality, but truth. Truth no one tried to avoid anymore. Because now she wasn't just part of the warehouse, she was its memory, its past, its present, and its direction, because in her attention lived what algorithms couldn't capture: the way light falls on a shelf when a box is out of place, the feeling when a crate is empty, even if it looks full, the sense of an impending glitch, an hour before the system catches it. And even those who once rolled their eyes at her slowness now slowed down beside her, not on purpose, not to imitate, but because her rhythm had become a second metronome, internal, precise, and now it was affecting them too. And the entire warehouse, this massive logistical structure built for years on timers, finally began to breathe humanly, not out of fear, not from pressure, but from a precise sense of how things should be when someone is truly present. And one evening, as the shift was winding down, with half the lights already off and only the quiet hum of the ventilation remaining, Varya stood by a far shelf, watching. Unhurried, unrushed, just watching, and a young employee walking by stopped and asked, "What are you looking at?" And she, without turning her gaze, eyes slightly narrowed, answered, "Everything's in place." And in that simple phrase, there was everything: knowledge, calm, responsibility, and above all, what everyone now understood: if she says everything is in place, then the warehouse is alive.